Cassandra Whitfield had been told by 4 separate persons in the village of Everleigh that she would not so much as reach the front door. "He has had 2 bailiffs turned off the drive with dogs," said the innkeeper's wife, refilling her tea with the particular relish of a woman delivering a warning she rather enjoyed giving, "and a solicitor's clerk sent back to Rye with his hat in the mud. The Duke of Everleigh does not receive persons who come about money, miss, whatever the rights of it." "I have not come to receive an audience, madam. I have come to collect what is owed my father." Cassandra set down her cup with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "Whether his grace wishes to see me is rather beside the point. He owes the sum. I intend to be paid it." She rode out to Everleigh Park the following morning with the ledger in her saddlebag, and 11 months of unanswered letters folded inside it, and she did not turn back at the gates, though the gates themselves were imposing enough to have discouraged a less determined woman, and she did not turn back at the look on the footman's face when she gave her name and her business in the same breath, and she did not turn back when she was left standing in the echoing marble hall for the better part of an hour, while somebody, somewhere in that vast cold house, decided what to do with her. She had not come lightly. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, had supplied wine to half the great houses of 3 counties for 30 years, honestly and at fair prices, and had built a business a daughter might have been proud to inherit had a fall from a hayloft not broken his hip that spring, and left him unable to manage it or to ride the 40 miles to Everleigh himself to do what letters had failed to do. The Duke's household owed Whitfield and Sons £412, accumulated over 2 years of deliveries and 2 years of increasingly desperate correspondence that had gone, every one of them, unanswered. £412 was not a fortune to a duke. It was, to a merchant recovering from a broken hip, with 3 younger children still at home, and a business bleeding credit, it could not spare the difference between solvency and ruin. Roland Ashe, 8th Duke of Everleigh, was informed by his butler that a young person had arrived unannounced concerning a debt, and he very nearly refused to see her, as he had refused the bailiffs and the solicitor's clerk before her, on the general principle that a duke besieged by his own father's creditors ought not to be expected to receive every one of them personally. He had inherited 4 years before an estate so thoroughly encumbered by his late father's mismanagement that he had spent every month since in a grim, unglamorous campaign of retrenchment, closing wings of the house, releasing half the staff, selling what could be sold without disgracing the family name entirely, and he had grown, in those 4 years, an instinctive, weary suspicion of anyone who arrived at his door wanting money, because there had been so very many of them, and because his own steward had assured him, repeatedly, that the household's remaining obligations were being managed as carefully as circumstances allowed. "Send her away, Fitch. I have neither the time nor the temper for another. She has asked me to give you this, your grace, before you decide." The butler held out a slim ledger, worn at the corners, and Roland Ashe, more out of irritation than curiosity, opened it and found 2 years of dated deliveries in a clear, careful hand, dozens of entries. Cases of claret and port and burgundy carried 40 miles by cart to his own cellars, each one initialed on receipt by his own steward, and beside each entry, in red ink, the running total of what remained unpaid. £412. He had not known. That was the thing that stopped him with his hand on the ledger's spine. He had believed, on his steward's word, that the household's tradesmen were being paid in the ordinary course of retrenchment, in careful order of priority, and here was proof in his own steward's handwriting that a merchant had been supplying his cellars faithfully for 2 years while receiving nothing at all in return. "Show her in," said the Duke of Everleigh. She came into the library with her chin level and her hands steady, in a plain grey travelling habit that had seen 40 muddy miles that morning, and she did not curtsy any lower than correctness strictly required, and she did not apologize for the intrusion. "Your Grace, I am Cassandra Whitfield of Whitfield and Sons. I believe you have had my ledger." "I have." Roland set it on the desk between them. "I did not know of this debt until this moment, Miss Whitfield, and I want that understood plainly before anything else passes between us. I have believed, on my steward's assurance, that my household's obligations were being settled in an orderly fashion. This is not orderly. This is 2 years of silence to a man whose livelihood, I gather, depends rather more urgently on £400 than mine does. My father broke his hip in March, Your Grace. He cannot ride, and I have 3 younger brothers and a sister still at home, and the business has extended credit it can no longer afford to extend. And I have been told by 3 separate persons in your own village this week that I would not so much as reach your door. Cassandra did not sit, because she had not been asked to. I am not here to be pitied. I am here to be paid what is owed, and I would be obliged if your Grace would tell me plainly whether that is possible, so that I may plan accordingly if it is not. Roland Ashe looked at her for a long moment, at the mud on her hem, and the steadiness of her hands, and the ledger with its careful red totals, and the particular quality of a woman who had ridden 40 miles expecting to be turned away, and had come anyway. And something in his chest, worn thin by 4 years of grim arithmetic and careful retrenchment, simply gave way. "It is possible," he said. "It will be paid within the hour in full, and I will write to your father myself, with an apology he is owed considerably more than the money. And then, Miss Whitfield, because I find I have entirely lost the capacity for careful behavior in the last 3 minutes, I am going to say something I have no earthly right to say to a woman I have known for the length of one conversation, and you may think whatever you like of me for it afterward. Your Grace, I do not think this is the moment. Marry me." The words fell into the library like a dropped glass, and Cassandra Whitfield stood very still in the middle of the carpet and stared at the Duke of Everley as though he had begun speaking in an unfamiliar language. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious, and I am aware of exactly how it sounds, which is why I said I would not blame you for thinking ill of me for it." Roland had come around the desk and stood now a careful distance from her, hands clasped behind his back as though physically restraining himself from some further impropriety. "I have spent 4 years managing an estate that my father's carelessness nearly destroyed, surrounded by people who tell me what I wish to hear rather than what is true, and I have just watched a woman ride 40 miles into a house she was warned would humiliate her, and stand in front of a duke she had never met, and ask for nothing but what was honestly owed her. I do not know how to explain it better than that. I looked at you and I understood, with a completeness I have not felt about anything in 4 years, precisely what has been missing from every room I have stood in since my father died. You have known me 11 minutes. I am aware of the arithmetic, Miss Whitfield. Then you will not be wounded," said Cassandra, gathering herself. "When I decline, I did not ride here to be proposed to, Your Grace, and I do not intend to be talked into a marriage by a man who cannot yet tell me one true thing about my character beyond the fact that I collect debts sufficiently. You are embarrassed by your steward's negligence and moved by the novelty of a woman who did not flatter you. And I have found that novelty and affection wear very different faces in the first hour, and look identical to a man who has not yet learned the difference. That is a harder judgment than I deserve. It is precisely the judgment you deserve, because you have just offered marriage to a woman on the strength of a debt you were ashamed to have left unpaid. And I will not spend the rest of my life wondering whether you married the guilt or the woman." Cassandra picked up her gloves from the chair where she had set them. "Pay what is owed my father, Your Grace. I will take that gladly because it is mine by right. I will not take the rest of it, however handsomely offered, until I have some better proof than 11 minutes and an empty conscience." He paid the debt that same afternoon in full, with a letter of apology to Thomas Whitfield that the old merchant would keep in a drawer for the rest of his life. And then, rather than accepting her refusal as the end of the matter, the Duke of Everley did the one thing Cassandra had not expected of him. He came to Rye, not with flowers, and not with jewels, and not with any of the performances a duke might reasonably be expected to make toward a merchant's daughter he wished to impress. He came, the first week, with his own account books, and asked to sit with Thomas Whitfield in the small parlour above the shop, and learn, properly, how a business the size of Whitfield and Sons was actually run, because he had discovered, going through his own steward's ledgers after Cassandra's visit, that he did not understand his own estate's finances nearly as well as a merchant's daughter understood hers, and he found he was ashamed of the gap. "You are here to learn arithmetic, Your Grace, or to court my daughter?" Thomas Whitfield asked, not unkindly, on the 3rd visit. "Both, sir, though I confess the arithmetic was meant to be the excuse, and has become rather genuinely useful in its own right." Roland turned a page of the ledger comparing a column against his own steward's figures, which he had brought with him. Your daughter told me I did not yet know one true thing about her character. I have concluded the only honest remedy is to spend enough time in her company and her family's that I might actually learn some. He came every week through that autumn by the ordinary post road, calling properly, sitting in the parlor above the shop with Cassandra and her father and her 3 younger siblings, who regarded a duke doing sums at their kitchen table with a fascination that took some months to wear into ordinary familiarity. He learned the names of the younger children. He learned that Cassandra's mother had died when the youngest was born, and that Cassandra had run the household accounts since she was 15, quietly, out of necessity, teaching herself from her father's old ledgers late at night after the shop closed, and that she had never once been thanked for it by anyone who understood what it had cost her to learn it alone. He thanked her for it now, plainly, without flourish, and watched it land somewhere she had not expected to be touched. You need not keep thanking me for arithmetic, Your Grace. It is only sums. It is a great deal more than sums, and you know it perfectly well, which is why you deflect it every time I say so. Roland set down his pen. You have kept a family fed and a business solvent since you were 15 years old, with no one to teach you and no one to thank you, and you speak of it as though it were no more remarkable than boiling an egg. I find that particular habit considerably more interesting than the arithmetic itself. What would you have me say instead? I would have you say it cost you something. I have watched you 3 visits running set your jaw in exactly the same way, when your father praises the shop's takings to a customer and does not think to mention whose hand kept the books through it. I do not think you begrudge him the credit. I think you have simply stopped expecting anyone to notice the difference. Cassandra was quiet a moment, turning her pen over in her ink-stained fingers. It cost me a great deal, she said finally. Lo, I was 15, Your Grace, and frightened, and my mother had just died, and I taught myself to read a ledger by candlelight, because the alternative was watching my father's business fail while he grieved too hard to notice the accounts were sliding. I have never said that aloud to anyone before this moment, and I find I do not entirely know what to do with having said it. You need not do anything with it, said Roland gently. You may simply let it have been heard. By November, the whole shop had grown accustomed to a duke's presence on Tuesday afternoons, though the novelty of it had not entirely worn off in the village, where the sight of a ducal carriage outside Whitfield and Sons still drew a small crowd of children to the window each week. Cassandra's youngest brother, a boy of 9 named Peter, had taken to following Roland about the shop, asking increasingly improbable questions about dukedoms, and Roland had taken in turn to answering every one of them with a seriousness that delighted the boy, and privately undid Cassandra rather more than she let show. Does a duke have to fight dragons? Regrettably not, though I confess a dragon would be a more straightforward adversary than a dishonest steward, which is the closest approximation Everleigh currently offers. Would you teach me to ride a proper horse if I came to visit? I would teach you to ride considerably better than proper, Peter, if your sister permits it, though I suspect she will supervise the lessons herself to be certain I have not exaggerated my own competence. Cassandra, watching from behind the counter, found she could not entirely account for the particular ache in her chest at the sight of a duke crouched at her little brother's level, patiently answering the 9th question about dragons, and she did not try very hard to name it, because she suspected she already knew. It was in October, on his 6th visit, that Cassandra finally asked him the question she had been turning over for weeks. Why did your steward not pay us? 2 years of silence is not an oversight, Your Grace. It is a decision made by somebody for some reason, and I have wondered whether you have troubled to discover what that reason actually was. Roland set down his pen slowly. I had assumed carelessness. I have not yet looked closer, because I confess I did not wish to find something worse than carelessness in a man I have trusted with my whole estate for 4 years. Then I would look closer, Your Grace, because a man does not simply forget to pay £400 for 2 years running while initialing every delivery himself. That requires deliberate choosing, and deliberate choosing requires a reason. And I have found that reasons of that particular kind are very rarely flattering to the person doing the choosing. The reason when Roland finally forced himself to examine his steward's full accounts rather than the summaries he had been handed for 4 years, was considerably worse than carelessness. Josiah Pruitt had managed the Everleigh estate for 11 years, through the old Duke's mismanagement and the new Duke's retrenchment alike, and he had done so, it emerged, by quietly diverting a portion of every economy Roland ordered into his own accounts, small sums at first, in the chaos of the old Duke's final years, and larger ones since, disguised as delayed payments to tradesmen who were too small and too distant to press hard for what they were owed. Whitfield and Sons, 40 miles off in Rye, had been an easy account to let run, a debt that could sit unpaid for years without a bailiff arriving at Everleigh's own door, while the money that should have discharged it went instead into Pruitt's own pocket, dressed up in the books as estate economies, per instruction. There had been no instruction. Roland had never once told Pruitt to withhold payment from a single tradesman. "You have been robbing me for 4 years," Roland said, standing in the estate office with the true account spread before him, and dressing it as the very retrenchment I asked you to manage on my behalf. And you very nearly cost a man his livelihood, and his daughter her family's whole future in the process. Your Grace, I can explain the discrepancy. You can explain it to a magistrate, Mr. Pruitt, because I have no further patience for explanations that have already cost me 2 years of a merchant's good faith, and very nearly cost me the one thing in 4 years that has made this house feel worth saving. Pruitt's composure, which had served him through 11 years of careful theft, finally cracked. "You have no notion what this estate was, Your Grace. When your father died and left it to you, a boy of 24 who had never balanced a single account in his life, I held this place together. I found the economies that kept the roof on when you would have sold the whole estate to a coal merchant out of sheer panic in your first year, and I have taken a fraction of what I saved you. And I do not consider it theft so much as a fee no one thought to offer me honestly." "You may make that argument to the magistrate as well," said Roland, "though I would advise you to consider, before you do, that a fraction taken in secret and dressed as another man's unpaid debt is a very different thing from a fee negotiated openly, and that the difference is precisely the one a court will care about. And the girl? Does she know what she is actually married into? A house built on a decade of my careful lying, now to be run by a merchant's daughter who thinks a clean ledger solves everything." "The girl," said Roland Ashe, "found the lie in 11 minutes that 11 years of your careful management hid from me entirely, Mr. Pruitt, and I would thank you to remember, for whatever remains of your liberty, that it was her honesty and not your theft that this estate was actually built to survive on." Pruitt did not go quietly. Once confronted, and his last act before the constable arrived was aimed precisely where it would do the most harm. He wrote to 3 of the county's principal families, the same families whose good opinion Roland had spent 4 grim years of retrenchment trying to preserve, suggesting, with careful plausibility, that the Duke of Everleigh's sudden and very public courtship of a wine merchant's daughter was rather less romantic than the county had been led to believe. That Miss Whitfield had, in fact, used her father's unpaid debt as leverage to secure a proposal from a duke desperate to avoid a scandal over his own household's mismanagement, and that the whole business would look very different examined without the sentiment attached. It was, Cassandra thought, reading a copy of the letter that had reached her father's parlor within the week, an unpleasant echo of the very suspicion she had voiced to Roland herself in the library at Everleigh. That novelty and affection could look identical in the wrong light, and that a clever liar need only borrow a woman's own honest doubt and dress it as fact. "You must deny it publicly," her father said, distressed. "A duke's word against a dismissed steward's spite. A duke's word denying it will sound exactly like a duke protecting his own choice, Papa, and will convince no one who was not already convinced." Cassandra set the letter down with the same steadiness she had carried into Everleigh's library months before. "There is only one account of this that will actually settle it, and it is not his to give. It is mine." She wrote to Roland that same evening, not to comfort him, but to propose a plan he did not entirely like and agreed to regardless, because he had learned, over 2 months of Tuesday visits, that her judgment on matters of this kind was considerably better than his own. She went, the following week, to call upon each of the 3 families Pruitt had written to, alone, without Roland beside her, and she told them plainly what she had told the Duke of Everleigh in his own library in August. But she had ridden to Everleigh Park expecting humiliation and had received, instead, an unplanned proposal she had refused on the spot, because she would not be talked into a marriage built on a stranger's guilty conscience. "I do not ask you to believe me because I am owed the benefit of the doubt," she told the last of the three, an elderly countess whose good opinion mattered a great deal in that county. "I ask you to consider the timing plainly. If I had used my father's debt as leverage for a proposal, my lady, I would hardly have refused the proposal the moment it was offered and spent, 2 months afterward making a duke earn it properly instead. Mr. Pruitt has invented a story that requires me to be a great deal cleverer and a great deal more patient than the actual history allows, and I would ask you to notice that the actual history is rather less flattering to romance and rather more flattering to my own good sense." The countess, who had buried 2 husbands and outlived a great many liars in her time, looked at Cassandra Whitfield for a long moment, and then laughed, properly, for the first time in the interview. "My dear," she said, "that is the single most convincing account of an unwanted proposal I have heard in 40 years, precisely because it is the least romantic. I believe every word of it, and I shall tell anyone who asks that Josiah Pruitt is a thief with a grudge and nothing more, and that the Duke of Everleigh has shown considerably better judgment in this matter than his father ever showed in anything." The second of the 3 families proved harder, a baronet's wife who had long harbored hopes of her own daughter for the Duke, and was not inclined to relinquish them gracefully on the strength of one merchant's word. "You will forgive me, Miss Whitfield, if I find it a very great deal to swallow that a tradesman's daughter refused a duke's proposal on principle. Most young women of my acquaintance would consider it the whole of their ambition answered." "Then most young women of your acquaintance have not spent 8 years keeping a family solvent through arithmetic nobody thanked them for, my lady, and have not learned, as I have, precisely what it costs to be valued for the wrong reason." Cassandra did not raise her voice, though the baronet's wife plainly expected her to. "I do not say this to shame your daughter's hopes, which are entirely reasonable and which I hold no grievance against whatever. I say it because you have asked me a direct question, and I find I owe you a direct answer. I refused him because being wanted suddenly for a reason built on guilt is not the same as being wanted properly, and I would rather have gone home to Rye unmarried than spend my whole life wondering which one I had actually got." The baronet's wife considered this for a long moment, her offence visibly warring with something that looked, despite itself, like respect. "That," she said at last, "is either the most calculated answer I have ever heard from a merchant's daughter, or the most honest one, and I confess I have grown too old to easily tell the two apart. I shall reserve judgment until I have observed you both together, Miss Whitfield, which I intend to do at the earliest opportunity." She was, true to her word, at the church in June, and left by her own later account, entirely satisfied. Pruitt was tried at the county assizes in the spring and transported for the theft, his own falsified account standing as evidence enough that no character witness could save him. Everleigh's finances, examined properly for the first time in a decade, proved considerably sounder than 4 years of grim retrenchment had led Roland to believe. Once the actual leak was found and stopped, and he was able that same spring to reopen the east wing of the house and rehire half the staff he had let go, believing the economy necessary. He came to Rye on the first fine day of April, not on his ordinary Tuesday, and found Cassandra in the shop itself, checking a delivery against her own ledger with the same careful hand that had once undone a thief. "I have not come about arithmetic today," he said. "No, I have come because I have spent 8 months learning your character properly, the way you asked me to, and I find I have learned rather more than I bargained for. That you are honest past the point of comfort, and stubborn past the point of easy management, and that you would rather be right than liked, which I have come to understand is the rarest quality in anyone who has ever stood in my presence." He took her hand, ink-stained as it was from the ledger, and did not seem to mind it in the least. "I am not proposing to discharge a debt this time, Cassandra. The debt was paid in August, honestly and in full, and it has nothing whatever to do with what I am asking now. I am asking because I have watched you ride 40 miles into a house that frightened everyone in the county, and defend yourself against a liar with nothing but your own plain account of the truth, and choose every single week since August to make me earn something I very nearly threw away by asking for it too quickly the first time. That is a considerably better proposal than the first one, Your Grace. I have had 8 months to improve it. Yes, said Cassandra Whitfield, setting down her ledger at last, and I find I have had 8 months to decide the answer, and it has been yes since October. Though I did not think it fair to tell you until you had finished doing the arithmetic properly. They were married in June, in the small church at Rye, rather than the grand chapel at Everley, because Cassandra would not be married anywhere her father could not easily reach on his still-mending hip. And the whole village came, and half the county besides, curious to see for themselves the woman who had walked into the most feared house in 3 counties, and walked out, eventually, with considerably more than a settled debt. Thomas Whitfield gave his daughter away leaning on a cane he no longer strictly needed, but kept, he said, because a man ought to have some visible proof of what a broken hip and an honest daughter could survive together. Peter, aged 10 by then, served as page and spent the whole ceremony visibly torn between solemnity and the enormous personal triumph of finally having a duke for a brother, and asked Roland at the wedding breakfast whether the title came with a sword. It comes with considerably more paperwork than sword, I am sorry to say, Roland told him gravely, though I am prepared to negotiate the point with your sister, who I have found manages every negotiation in this family a great deal better than I do. The following spring, the cellars at Everley were fuller than they had been in a decade, every case accounted for in a ledger the Duchess kept herself, in the same clear hand that had once totted up 2 years of unanswered debt in red ink. Pruitt writes from the ship, if you can credit it, Roland said, joining his wife in the estate office with the morning's post. Some clerk aboard let him send a letter begging character enough to secure work at the far end of it. I find I am not moved to provide one, nor I. Cassandra did not look up from the column she was totaling. Your steward's replacement has sent the quarterly figures early again. I confess it is the most restful habit any man in your employ has ever developed. You have made this house honest, Cassandra. I do not think you entirely credit how much that is worth. I have made this house's books honest, Your Grace. You made the house itself worth the honesty, 4 years before I ever rode up your drive, by refusing to let it be sold off in pieces, when a lesser man would have simply walked away from the wreck his father left him. She set down her pen and looked at him properly. I did not marry a debt, and I did not marry a duke who was ashamed of himself. I married a man who spent 8 months learning to be worth trusting, which is a considerably harder thing to become than either, and I have found I do not regret 1 mile of that first 40.